The dust of Pine Mesa was a fine, red powder that coated everything in the late summer of 1878. It settled on the brims of hats, crept through the floorboards of the general store, and gave the endless fields of foxtail grass a hazy, rust-colored tint. The wind, when it came down from the mountains, carried the sharp, clean scent of pine. But today it was still, and the air tasted of little more than sun-baked earth. From the east, a sound that was becoming more frequent, but no less foreign. The long, mournful cry of a train whistle sliced through the quiet. It was the sound of a world that was coming, whether Pine Mesa was ready for it or not. Elias Boone stood on the porch of the land office, his shadow long in the afternoon light. At 32, he had the settled, patient look of a man who had already done his share of moving. His time with the cavalry had carved lines of discipline around his eyes and mouth, but his ranch had given him a quiet strength, a way of standing that seemed rooted to the ground itself. He was known in the territory as a man of his word, fair in his dealings and slow to anger. All he wanted now was the peace he had earned, a life as predictable as the seasons, with a wife to share the silence and perhaps, in time, fill it with the sounds of a family. His plan for this was practical, like most of his plans. A correspondence with a sensible widow in St. Louis, a woman whose letters were neat and whose stated desires mirrored his own stability. Companionship, an end to loneliness. Her name was Agnes, and she was due on the 4 o'clock stage. Elias checked the silver watch in his vest pocket. 4 o'clock. He looked down the government road, a long, empty ribbon stretching into the heat. The dust was the only thing moving. He had spent the morning making sure the small house he had built at the edge of his property was ready. The floors were swept, the pantry stocked, and a jar of wildflowers sat on the kitchen table, a concession to sentiment that felt both necessary and slightly foolish. He was not a man given to grand gestures. He believed in things that were solid, things you could build with your hands: a good fence, a sturdy barn, a life of quiet decency. This marriage was to be the final post in that fence. The rumble came first, a low vibration in the soles of his boots. Before the stagecoach appeared as a dark speck in the distance, it grew slowly, resolving itself into a familiar shape, pulled by 4 tired horses kicking up a cloud of that relentless red dust. It rolled down the main street and pulled to a halt in front of the hotel, the horses heaving, their coats dark with sweat. Elias pushed off the post he had been leaning against and walked toward it, his steps measured. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, the nervousness of a man stepping into a future he had only read about in letters. The driver, a leather-faced man named Pete, nodded at him. "Afternoon, Boone." "Pete." Elias nodded back, his eyes on the coach door. The door swung open. A man in a dusty suit got out, followed by a woman clutching a small, whimpering child. Not them. Then, another figure appeared in the doorway, pausing for a moment to let her eyes adjust to the glare. Elias stopped. This was not Agnes. Agnes, according to her letters and the small, faded photograph she had sent, was a woman of plain features and brown hair, her expression one of weary resolve. The woman descending from the stagecoach was anything but plain. Her hair was the color of a sunset, a deep, fiery red pinned up against the heat, with loose tendrils framing a face that was sharper and more intelligent than any photograph could capture. Her eyes, the color of new spring leaves, swept over the small town with a quick, assessing glance before they landed on him. She was dressed in a traveling suit of dark blue, practical but cut with a skill that spoke of a city tailor. She held herself with a straight-backed confidence that seemed entirely out of place in the weary slump of Pine Mesa. She stepped down, her boots making a soft puff in the dust. She was holding a leather portfolio. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. "You must be Elias Boone," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, with a clear, resonant quality. Elias found his own voice after a moment. I believe you have me at a disadvantage." "My name is Rosa Hart," she said, and extended a gloved hand. He took it automatically. Her grip was firm. I have a letter for you. From Agnes. A knot of confusion and irritation tightened in his gut. He led her away from the commotion of the stage to the relative quiet of the covered boardwalk in front of his empty storefront, a building he had bought on a whim and had yet to find a use for. He took the letter she offered. The handwriting was Agnes's, but it was shaky, hurried. He read it quickly. It was a letter of apology and regret. A fever had taken hold of her youngest, and in the long nights of nursing him back, she had found her courage had deserted her. The frontier, once a symbol of a new beginning, now seemed a vast and terrifying wilderness. She could not come. She wished him well. Elias folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. The neat, ordered future he had planned had just evaporated into the dusty air. He felt a sharp sting of disappointment, followed by a wave of weary resignation. It had been a long shot, he supposed. I am sorry to be the bearer of such news, Rosa Hart said, her green eyes watching him, missing nothing. It is not your fault, he said, his tone flat. The mail is slow, but it seems bad news travels at the speed of horseflesh. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. She was not a woman who belonged here. There was a restlessness about her, a current of energy that Pine Mesa, with its slow rhythms and quiet desperation, could never contain. What is your business in this town, Miss Hart? There is not much here for a woman like you. A woman like me. A small, wry smile touched her lips. And what kind of woman is that, Mr. Boone? The kind that does not look like she is searching for a quiet life, he answered, meeting her gaze. Her smile faded. Quiet is a luxury I have not been able to afford, and my business here, as it happens, is you, or rather, the man who was meant to be your father-in-law. Had Agnes made the journey? She paused, letting that settle. I knew her brother. He spoke of you. He said you were a man of integrity, an honest man in a dishonest world. Elias said nothing. Compliments made him uneasy. He also said you were stubborn, and that you wanted nothing more than to be left alone on your ranch, she continued. I am afraid I am about to disturb your peace, Mr. Boone. I came to deliver that letter. But I also came to deliver a warning. She opened her portfolio and drew out a map, spreading it on a dusty barrel between them. It was a survey map of the territory, but with new lines drawn in red ink, showing a proposed spur line for the railroad, a line that cut directly through the valley, right across Pine Creek, the lifeblood of his ranch and every other farm and homestead in the area. This is not the official route, she said, her voice low and urgent. This is the one Silas Crow intends to build. The name landed like a stone in the quiet afternoon. Silas Crow. His name was spoken in whispers in saloons and boardrooms from Denver to Helena, a man who built railroads and opened mines, who bought politicians and sheriffs with the same casual indifference he bought land, a man who saw the West not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be broken open. Crow wants the coal seam that runs under this valley, Rosa said, her finger tracing another red line that ended at a place marked Pine Mesa Mine. To get it, he needs the water from the creek. To get the water, he needs the land, your neighbor's land, the whole town. Elias stared at the map. He had heard rumors of the mine reopening, of the railroad needing a new route, but he had dismissed it as saloon talk. Now, looking at the precise, confident lines on the paper, it felt chillingly real. How did you come by this? I am a dressmaker, she said, a good one. And wealthy men have wives and daughters who like fine clothes. They also have offices where they leave papers on their desks. They talk, thinking a seamstress is just part of the furniture. Her expression hardened. Silas Crow is not a man who likes to be told no. He wanted more from me than my skill with a needle and thread. When I refused, he tried to have me declared hysterical and locked away. He does not like loose ends, Mr. Boone, and he believes I took certain documents with me when I left Denver. Did you? His question was blunt. I took what was mine, she replied, her chin lifting a fraction. My tools, my designs, and my good name. But I also made copies of certain ledgers, receipts for bribes paid to land office clerks and county assessors. Enough to show that his plans for Pine Mesa are built on a foundation of fraud. Elias felt a cold anger begin to smolder beneath his disappointment. He had come here to escape men like Crow, men who used their power like a club. He had seen enough of that in the army, enough of greed and violence to last him a lifetime. He looked away from her, out at the dusty street, at the town that was, for all its flaws, his home. He saw the blacksmith's shop, the small church, the saloon where he sometimes shared a quiet beer. He saw the Henderson Ranch in his mind's eye, the family that had been his closest neighbors for 5 years. Crow's railroad would wipe them all away. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 32 years, screamed at him to walk away. This was not his fight. This woman was a whirlwind, and she would drag him and his quiet life into the heart of a storm. He could give her some money, see her safely on the next stage heading west, and go back to his ranch. He could pretend he had never seen the map, never heard the name Silas Crow. But then he looked at Rosa Hart. He saw the exhaustion under her fierce pride, the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. He saw a woman who had fought for herself and was now, for reasons he could not quite fathom, trying to fight for a town full of strangers. The part of him that was a soldier, the part that believed in standing a post, would not let him turn his back. His conscience, it turned out, was a heavier burden than his desire for peace. "Crow will have men here," he said, thinking aloud. "He will not let you stand in his way." "They are already here," she said quietly. "The new deputy marshal, Briggs. He is one of Crow's men. I saw him watching the stage when we arrived." Elias's jaw tightened. He had not liked the look of Briggs, a man with cold, predatory eyes. It all clicked into place. The pieces of a game he had not even known was being played. He was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching between them. Rosa Hart waited, her gaze steady. She did not plead or push. She had laid the facts before him and was letting him make his own decision. He respected that. "Finally," he spoke, his voice low and decisive. "You will need a place to stay, and a way to earn a living, a reputation." He gestured with his chin toward the empty storefront behind them. "I own this building. It was a mercantile before the owner passed. It has been empty for a year." She looked from him to the building, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you suggesting?" "A business proposition," he said, his tone all practicality, purely business. "You need a place to set up shop, to become a part of this town so you are not just a woman passing through. I will rent it to you. A fair price. You can open your dressmaking business, Heart and Thread, or whatever you choose to call it." Her eyes widened slightly, suspicion and a flicker of hope warring in their green depths. "And in return," Elias said, meeting her gaze directly, "you will help me with my paperwork, tax assessments, land deeds, contracts. My reading is slow, and the legal language is designed to confuse a plain man. You are educated. You can read these documents for me. You can help me understand what it is I am signing, and what it is Silas Crow is trying to steal." It was a partnership born of necessity, a purely practical arrangement. He was offering her a chance to build a legitimate identity, a shield of respectability. She was offering him the knowledge to defend his property, his home. It was a transaction, nothing more. A way for him to engage in this fight from a safe distance, without getting his hands dirty, without letting the whirlwind of Rosa Hart pull him all the way in. A slow smile spread across her face, transforming it. The weariness seemed to fall away, replaced by a spark of the wit he had glimpsed earlier. "Heart and Thread," she mused, testing the words. "It has a certain ring to it. Very well, Mr. Boone, it seems we have a deal." He nodded once. The matter settled. "Welcome to Pine Mesa, Miss Hart." As he turned to unlock the door of the old mercantile, a gust of wind swept down the street, kicking up the red dust. It swirled around them, coating their boots. A fine, gritty film that promised more trouble was on its way. Across the valley, the train whistle blew again. a long, lonely cry that sounded less like progress and more like a threat. The quiet life Elias Boone had so carefully planned was over. It had ended the moment a woman with sunset hair and secrets in her eyes had stepped off the afternoon stage. The old mercantile shed its skin of dust and neglect under Rosa Hart's determined hands. For a week, the sounds of hammering and scraping echoed from its open doors, a novel industry on a street accustomed to the slow creak of wagon wheels and the lazy buzz of flies. Elias came into town more than he had in the previous 6 months combined. A load of fresh-cut pine in his wagon for shelves, a heavy slab of oak for a cutting table. He told himself it was a landlord's duty to ensure the property was sound. He told himself he was merely fulfilling his end of their business arrangement. He did not tell himself that he found the sight of Rosa, her fiery hair tied back with a scrap of cloth, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a look of fierce concentration in her eyes, more compelling than the quiet solitude of his ranch. She worked with a tireless, focused energy that transformed the space. The grimy windows were washed until they sparkled, letting in the strong Montana light. The floors were scrubbed with lye soap and water until the wood grain showed clean and pale. Soon, the shop, christened Heart and Thread with a neatly painted sign Elias helped her hang, began to fill with the tools of her trade, a gleaming black sewing machine, bolts of fabric in calico and wool, and a rainbow of threads on wooden spools. As a final touch, she hung a length of brilliant emerald green silk in the front window. It caught the sun like a jewel, a defiant splash of color against the town's dusty palette, a flag of hope and pride planted on new soil. The women of Pine Mesa came, drawn by curiosity as much as need. At first they came in pairs, as if for protection, their gazes darting around the clean, bright space. They were farmers' wives who needed sturdy dresses mended, and the wives of the town's few merchants who wanted a new bonnet for Sunday service. Rosa treated them all with the same cheerful professionalism, taking measurements with a practiced hand. Her conversation easy and her suggestions sensible. Many left impressed, whispering about the quality of her stitching and the fairness of her prices. But not everyone was charmed. The whispers started in the general store, quiet as the rustle of mice in a grain sack. They followed Rosa down the street, a shadow she could feel but not see. The source, she soon learned, was Beatrice Whitcomb, the mayor's wife, a woman whose face was permanently puckered as if from sucking on a lemon. "A songbird from Denver, I hear, Mrs." Whitcomb said one afternoon, loud enough for half the mercantile to hear, while ostensibly examining a can of peaches. "They say she has expensive tastes. Funny that she would end up in a place like this." The implication was as clear as it was ugly. Rosa, who was at the counter waiting to pay for a sack of flour, did not flinch. She turned slowly, her green eyes calm, and met the older woman's gaze. "I am a seamstress, Mrs. Whitcomb," she said, her voice pleasant but firm. "My tastes run to good thread and sharp needles, and I find Pine Mesa has an abundance of honest work, which is all a woman with a trade can ask for." The directness of the reply flustered the mayor's wife. She flushed a dull red, mumbled something about the price of peaches, and bustled out of the store. The silence she left behind was thick with unspoken thoughts. Rosa paid for her flour, nodded to the storekeeper, and walked out with her head held high, leaving the whispers to wither in her wake. That evening, Elias stopped by the shop. He had finished the last of the shelves and was carrying the heavy cutting table he had built in his workshop. He set it down in the center of the room with a solid thud. "This should do," he said, running a hand over the smooth oak surface. "It is more than good, Elias. It is perfect," Rosa said, her appreciation genuine. "Now, what do I owe you for the lumber and your labor?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing. Consider it an improvement to the property." "I will not," she said flatly. She went to a small lockbox and took out a ledger. "I know what good lumber costs, and I know what a carpenter's time is worth. I will not have people thinking I am living on your charity." He frowned, a little stung by her tone. "It is not charity. Anything a man gives a woman for free is suspect in a town like this," she said, looking up at him, her expression serious. "I am renting this building from you. and I will pay for these materials. That is our arrangement. Business." She paused, then added, "And there is the matter of the rent. We never settled on a price." "Whatever you think is fair," he said, uncomfortable. He had not even thought about the money. "No," she countered, a glint of humor in her eyes. "You are the landlord. You will name a price, and it had better not be a penny less than market rate, or I will charge you double for sorting through your tax papers." Elias found himself fighting a smile. He was not used to being challenged, and certainly not with such sharp, good-natured wit. She was right, of course. For her to build a life here, everything had to be proper and above board. Her reputation was the only currency she had. $5 a month, he said, naming the standard rate for a commercial property on the main street. She nodded, satisfied, and $2 for the wood and the work. That makes $7. I will pay you at the end of the week. She made a neat entry in her ledger. The matter was closed. He found himself lingering, reluctant to leave the warm, lamp-lit space for the growing dark outside. He was moving further and further from the quiet, uncomplicated life he had planned. That plan had involved a woman named Agnes, a woman he imagined would be grateful and quiet and accommodating. It had not involved a sharp-witted dressmaker who negotiated business terms as if she were trading cattle and who met gossip with the cool resolve of a veteran soldier. His life was becoming more complicated by the day, and the most complicated part of it all was that he did not seem to mind. The peace of the next few days was a fragile thing, easily broken. It shattered on a Thursday afternoon when 3 men stopped in front of Heart and Thread. One was Deputy Marshal Briggs, his tin star pinned to a dirty vest, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. The other 2 were strangers, hard-faced men with guns tied low on their hips, the kind of men who drifted from one boomtown to another, selling their loyalty to the highest bidder. They stood across the street for a long time, watching. Rosa felt their eyes on her through the window, a physical pressure. Her hands, usually so steady at her work, trembled slightly. She took a deep breath, placed her sewing scissors on the table with a deliberate click, and stood up. She would not hide. Elias was loading the last of his supplies into his wagon when he saw them. He recognized Briggs, and he recognized the type of men with him. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He watched as they crossed the street, their boots stirring up the dust, and pushed their way into Rosa's shop without so much as a knock. He moved without thinking, his long strides covering the distance in moments. His body remembered the feeling, the cold, clear-headed purpose that came before a fight. Inside the shop, the air was thick with menace. The 2 hired guns had positioned themselves on either side of the door. Briggs was standing in front of the cutting table, leaning on it with one hand, his posture a study in casual intimidation. "Miss Hart," Briggs said, his voice a low drawl, "we have had a report of some stolen property, certain papers that belong to my employer, Mr. Crow." Rosa stood behind the table, using it as a barrier. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "I have no idea what you are talking about. Marshal, everything in this shop belongs to me." "Now, I do not think that is true," Briggs sneered, his eyes roaming over her. "See, Mr. Crow is a very particular man. He likes his things returned, especially things that could cause him embarrassment. A smart woman would understand that. A smart woman would hand them over and save herself a great deal of trouble." "I am a seamstress," Rosa repeated, her voice like ice, "not a thief. Now, if you do not have any official business here, I will ask you to leave my place of business." Briggs laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This is official business, and we are not leaving until we get what we came for." He took a step around the table. "That is far enough, Briggs." The voice came from the doorway. It was quiet, but it cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Elias stood there, filling the frame. He was not wearing a gun, but he did not need one. His presence was a solid, unmovable fact. His eyes were fixed on Briggs, and they held a look of such cold, controlled anger that the deputy marshal actually took a step back. "Boone," Briggs said, his hand dropping instinctively toward his pistol. "This does not concern you. This is my property," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. "And Miss Hart is my tenant. That makes this my concern." He took a step into the room, placing himself squarely between Briggs and Rosa. "You have no warrant. You have no cause. You are here to intimidate a woman who has done nothing wrong. So I will say this once. Get out." For a long moment, no one moved. The two hired guns shifted, their eyes flicking from Elias to Briggs, waiting for a signal. Briggs stared at Elias, his face a mask of fury. He was weighing his options, calculating the risk. He saw the rancher in front of him, the quiet man who kept to himself. But he also saw the ex-cavalryman, a man who knew how to handle violence, a man who was not afraid. Finally, with a curse under his breath, Briggs broke the standoff. He straightened up and jerked his head toward the door. "This is not over. Boone," he spat. "Crow gets what he wants. Always." He pushed past Elias and stormed out into the street, his men trailing behind him like dogs. The silence they left behind was heavy. Rosa let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her knees suddenly weak. She gripped the edge of the cutting table for support. Elias turned to her. "Are you all right?" She nodded, managing a shaky smile. "I am now, thank you." He simply nodded, the muscles in his jaw still tight. The threat had been dealt with for now, but they both knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Briggs was a symptom. Crow was the disease. Later that night, long after the lamps in Pine Mesa had been extinguished one by one, they sat in the back room of the shop, the map spread out on the small kitchen table between them. The red lines seemed to glow in the lamplight, a stark and brutal declaration of intent. Rosa traced the proposed railroad spur with her finger. It cut a ruthless path across the landscape, ignoring property lines and natural contours. It forded Pine Creek right at the spot where the valley's ranches drew their water for irrigation and for their herds. "If he builds this," Elias said, his voice grim, "he controls the water. If he controls the water, he kills every ranch for 20 miles. "He will not just kill the ranches," Rosa said quietly. "He will kill the town. Pine Mesa only exists to serve the ranchers and the homesteaders. If they are gone, this place will become nothing more than a camp for his miners. He will own everything, the store, the saloon, the houses. Everyone will work for him, live in his properties, and drink his whiskey. It will be his kingdom." They stared at the map, at the blueprint of their own destruction. The threat was no longer an abstract warning delivered on a dusty afternoon. It had a face now, the sneering face of Marshall Briggs, and it had a purpose, written in red ink. The quiet life Elias wanted and the new beginning Rosa sought were both staked on the future of this small, dusty town, and the future was about to be decided by a battle over a creek. The first sign of trouble was the smell, a sharp, acrid scent of burning hay that cut through the cool night air. Then came the frantic clang of the blacksmith's hammer against his anvil, the town's makeshift fire alarm, a deep, resonant panic. Elias was halfway to his barn to check on his own stock when he saw the glow in the sky to the west, a furious orange stain against the backdrop of stars. It was coming from the direction of the Henderson place. He did not hesitate. He swung onto the back of his fastest horse, bareback, and kicked it into a gallop, the wind cold against his face. By the time he reached the ridge overlooking the Henderson homestead, the horse barn was a roaring inferno, a hungry beast of flame devouring the dry timber and spitting embers into the dark. Men were already forming a bucket brigade from the well, a futile effort against such a blaze, their shouts lost in the roar and the terrified screaming of the horses trapped inside. John Henderson was standing near the barn doors, his face a mask of helpless horror, his wife trying to pull him back. "My prize stallion," he was yelling, his voice raw with anguish. "He is still in there." Elias slid off his horse and grabbed 2 wet blankets from a woman in the brigade. He threw one over his head and shoulders and ran toward the barn. Henderson's wife screamed his name, but he did not stop. He had seen the terror in the eyes of horses caught in a prairie fire once before. It was a sight that had never left him. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that seared his lungs with every breath. Smoke boiled out of the entrance, thick and black and choking. Inside was a vision of hell. Flames licked up the walls and rained down from the hayloft. Through the swirling smoke, he could see the terrified shapes of the animals, their eyes white with fear, crashing against the walls of their stalls. He worked methodically, his movements economical despite the urgency. He unlatched the first stall, slapping the panicked mare on the rump and driving her toward the distant square of less dark that was the open door. Then the next, and the next. He found the stallion in the last stall, a magnificent black creature, wild with terror, rearing and kicking at the burning wood. A heavy beam from the loft above crashed down, showering them with sparks and blocking their escape. The horse screamed, a sound of pure agony. Elias talked to it, his voice low and steady, the words meaningless, the tone, everything. He used the blanket to shield the animal's eyes and, with a strength born of desperation, heaved at the fallen beam, clearing a narrow path. As he pushed the stallion through, another section of the roof gave way. He threw himself forward, following the horse, but a tongue of flame from a falling timber licked across his arm and side, and the world dissolved into a searing, blinding pain. He stumbled out into the cool night air, the smell of burned cloth and his own seared flesh filling his nostrils, and collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath in air that felt suddenly, blessedly clean. Rosa arrived with a wagon full of blankets and medical supplies from Dr. Avery's office. She had seen the glow from her window, and her first thought had been of Elias, a cold fist of fear clenching in her stomach. She organized the women, tearing sheets for bandages, her hands moving with a swift, competent grace. She was wrapping a burn on a young farmhand's arm when she saw him. He was sitting on the ground, leaning against a wagon wheel, his face pale and smudged with soot, his eyes closed. Dr. Avery was kneeling beside him, cutting away the burned fabric of his shirt. "The smoke inhalation is my main concern," the old doctor said, looking up at her. "And these burns will need watching. They are not deep, but they cover a wide area." He gave Elias a dose of laudanum for the pain and looked around at the chaos. "He needs to be somewhere quiet. My office will be full of casualties all night." "Take him to his ranch," Rosa said, the decision made in an instant. "I will go with you. I can tend to him there." The doctor looked at her, his gaze sharp and knowing, but he simply nodded. It is the best place for him. The ride to the ranch was a blur. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, his head lolling against her shoulder. His house was just as she had imagined, spare, clean, and profoundly masculine. A stone fireplace, a few sturdy pieces of furniture he had likely built himself, and a notable lack of any softening, feminine touch. They got him into his bed, and the doctor showed her how to clean the burns and apply the soothing salve. "Keep the bandages damp," he instructed before he left, "and make him drink water when he can. I will be back in the morning." And then they were alone. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire Rosa had built in the hearth and the ragged sound of Elias's breathing. She sat in a chair beside his bed, a basin of cool water at her feet, and watched him sleep. In the flickering firelight, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. The guarded look was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that made her heart ache. She had spent so long building walls around herself, and yet this quiet, stubborn man had walked past them without even seeming to notice they were there. He woke near dawn, his eyes clear but clouded with pain. He tried to sit up and fell back with a groan. "Easy," she said softly, rising to help him drink some water. "The doctor said you are to rest." He drank, then looked at her. Really looked at her, his gaze taking in her weary face, the smudge of soot on her cheek. "You should not be here," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "And where should I be?" she asked, her voice gentle. "You saved John Henderson's horses. Someone had to save you." She took a cloth, dipped it in the cool water, and began to dampen the bandages on his arm. Her touch was light, professional, yet it sent a tremor through him. They were quiet for a long time. The intimacy of the situation, the stillness of the room, seemed to lower their defenses. "I hate fire," he said at last, his voice barely a whisper. He was staring at the flames in the hearth. "I saw a whole village burn once, up on the border. We were too late to stop it. The noise, and then the quiet afterward. I came here looking for quiet." Rosa's hands stilled. She saw the ghost of that fire in his eyes, the memory of a violence he had been powerless to prevent. It was the first piece of his past he had ever offered her, a key to understanding the deep well of stillness he surrounded himself with. It was not aloofness. It was a shield. Seeing his vulnerability gave her the courage to share her own. "Silas Crow tried to put me in a place like this once," she said, her voice low and tight. "Not a house with a warm fire, a sanitarium. He had a doctor, a man on his payroll, ready to sign the papers." Elias turned his head on the pillow to look at her, his focus absolute. "He said I was prone to fits of hysteria," she continued, the memory still sharp, still humiliating. "He told people my passions were unmanageable. It was because I would not let him manage me. Because I saw his business for what it was, and I was not afraid to say so. The most terrifying part was how easily people believed him. A man of his stature, his wealth, a woman with opinions, with a will of her own. It was so much easier to believe she was unwell than to believe he was a monster." She had never told anyone the full story, the depth of her fear and rage, but in the quiet of this room, with this wounded, decent man, the words came easily. She was not just a victim in her story. She was a fighter. She had found a doctor who refused to be bought, who had testified to her sanity. She had escaped, but the fear of being trapped, of having her own mind and spirit used as a weapon against her, had never left her. Elias reached out with his good hand and covered hers where it rested on his arm. His touch was warm and solid. "He will not do that to you again," he said, his voice rough with conviction. "I will not let him." The sun was rising when she left the next morning, leaving him asleep. She walked back to town as the first wagons were starting to move, the ordinary sounds of a new day beginning. But something had changed. The air was full of smoke and whispers. She found them in the general store, a knot of women clustered around Beatrice Whitcomb. The mayor's wife fell silent the moment Rosa walked in, but it was too late. The word spent the night and at his ranch hung in the air, thick and ugly. "Mrs. Whitcomb recovered first, giving Rosa a look of pure, venomous satisfaction. "Well, Miss Hart," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We were all so worried. It is a relief to see you are unharmed." Rosa walked directly to the counter, her back straight, and placed her order for coffee and bread. She could feel every eye in the store on her. She did not look at them until her items were wrapped and paid for. Then she turned, her gaze sweeping over the silent, watchful faces until it landed on Mrs. Whitcomb. "Mr. Boone was injured saving his neighbor's property," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the store. "Dr. Avery asked me to look after him. As I have some skill in nursing, I did my duty, just as every man in this town did his duty fighting that fire." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I am a seamstress who makes dresses and men's shirts. I am not a story for you to tell over the back fence. My character is my own, and I will thank you all to leave it be." She turned and walked out, the bell over the door chiming her exit into a stunned silence. That afternoon, Elias walked into her shop. He was pale and moved stiffly, his arm in a sling, but he was on his feet. The burns on his arm and side were covered in fresh white bandages. "You should be in bed," she said, a sharp note of concern in her voice. "The doctor was by. He said I can move around, as long as I do not strain myself." He replied. He looked around the neat, orderly shop, then met her eyes. "I heard what you said to Beatrice Whitcomb." Rosa's chin lifted. "I hope I did not cause you any trouble." "The only trouble is the gossip. He said, and you put a stop to that right quick. Thank you." He looked down at his bandaged arm, at the angry red skin visible at the edges. "I have been thinking about the fire. The Hendersons are good people. They have worked that land for 10 years. Crow's men were in the saloon last night, buying drinks for everyone, talking about how dangerous it is out here, talking about how a man with money could offer a fair price for the land to help folks move somewhere safer. He looked up, and the quiet resignation in his eyes had been replaced by a hard, cold anger. This is not just about maps and legal papers anymore. He is trying to burn people out, to scare them into selling. I wanted a quiet life, but there is no peace when a wolf is circling the fold. His decision was made. It was there in the set of his jaw, in the fire that had replaced the weariness in his eyes. He was no longer a man caught between his conscience and his desires. He was a man with a purpose. Rosa felt a surge of something fierce and protective. He had stood up for her. Now, she would stand with him. She went to her sewing box, to a secret compartment hidden beneath a false bottom. She took out a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper and handed it to him. He took it with his good hand and unfolded it. It was a copy of a receipt, written in a fine clerk's hand, acknowledging payment of $500 from an agent of the Transcontinental Railroad Company to the county tax assessor. The memo line contained only 2 words, Pine Mesa. "It is the first piece," she said quietly. "Proof that he bought the man who assesses the value of our land and our property. It is how he plans to tax people into ruin so he can seize their land for pennies on the dollar." Elias stared at the paper, a small, flimsy weapon against a powerful man. He looked from the damning words on the page to the determined woman standing before him. Then he looked at his burned hand. It was the price he had already paid to protect his community. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. It was the first shot in a war he now knew he had to fight. The quiet that settled over Pine Mesa after the fire was a brittle, watchful thing. The air still carried the faint, ghostly scent of ash, and every stranger who rode into town was met with suspicious eyes. The people were waiting. They did not know what was coming next, only that the fire at the Henderson place had not been an accident, and that the confrontation at Heart and Thread had been a skirmish, not a final battle. The battle came a week later, on a hot, windless afternoon when the sun beat down on the dusty street with a merciless intensity. It arrived not just with guns, but with the law, or a twisted version of it. A carriage, sleek and black and utterly out of place, rolled into town, pulled by 2 perfectly matched gray horses. Deputy Marshal Briggs rode alongside it, his 2 hired guns flanking him like grim outriders. The carriage stopped in front of Rosa's shop. A man stepped out, a man Pine Mesa had never seen before. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, despite the heat, and carried a leather briefcase. He had a pale, narrow face and small, clever eyes that took in the dusty frontier town with an expression of profound distaste. This was Mr. Finney, a lawyer from Helena, a man whose skill lay in bending the law until it served the will of men like Silas Crow. The town seemed to hold its collective breath. Shopkeepers appeared in their doorways. From the saloon, Lila, the proprietor, stepped onto the boardwalk, her arms crossed. At the far end of the street, the steady ring of Jake the blacksmith's hammer fell silent. He emerged from the smoky darkness of his smithy, wiping his hands on a leather apron, his powerful forearms thick with muscle. Elias saw them from the land office, where he had been going over tax records with Rosa. A cold, familiar calm settled over him. He had known this was coming. He took his rifle from the scabbards on his saddle, checked the action, and walked out to stand on the boardwalk in front of Heart and Thread. He did not raise the weapon, but let it rest in the crook of his arm. A silent statement. Rosa came out to stand beside him. Her face was pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her leather portfolio, but her eyes were steady. Briggs dismounted, his spurs jingling with a sound that was both festive and menacing. "Afternoon. Boone," he said with a smirk. "We are not here for you today. We are here on official county business." The lawyer, Finney, stepped forward, opening his briefcase. He produced a document with a flourish, a paper bearing an official-looking seal. "I have a writ of seizure for this property and its contents," he announced, his voice thin and reedy, ill-suited to the open air. issued by the county court on account of delinquent taxes owed by its proprietor, Miss Rosa Hart. A murmur went through the small crowd of onlookers. Taxes were a constant worry, a weapon the distant and often corrupt county government used to squeeze the homesteaders. "That is impossible," Rosa said, her voice clear and strong. "I have my receipts. My taxes are paid in full." Finney gave her a patronizing smile. An administrative error, perhaps. Nevertheless, the writ is legal and binding. Furthermore, he added, his voice hardening, "I have a warrant for your arrest, Miss Hart, on charges of theft of private documents belonging to Mr. Silas Crow." This was it. The attack was two-pronged. They would take her business, and they would take her freedom. Elias felt a surge of cold fury. His thumb brushed the hammer of his rifle. "You will not lay a hand on her," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is the law." "Boone!" Briggs sneered, his hand hovering over his gun. "Are you going to stand against the law?" Before Elias could answer, Rosa took a step forward. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but a deeper, more stubborn anger burned it away. She had been running from this man and his accusations for too long. Here, in this dusty street, with this quiet rancher by her side and the eyes of a town upon her, she would stop running. "You speak of the law, Mr. Finney," she said, meeting the lawyer's gaze. "Let us talk about the law." She opened her own portfolio. The papers she held were not as crisp or official as his, but they held a different kind of power, the power of truth. "This," she said, holding up the first document, "is a sworn affidavit from a man named Thomas, formerly a footman in the employ of Silas Crow. He states that he was present on 3 separate occasions when Mr. Crow boasted of having the Pine Mesa tax assessor in his pocket. He also states that he was instructed to burn a set of ledgers, but that he was a God-fearing man and could not bring himself to do it." Finney's pale face seemed to lose another shade of color. He took an involuntary step back. "This," Rosa continued, producing another paper, "is an affidavit from a woman named Mary, a former housemaid. She testifies that she was instructed to pack away my belongings after I left Mr. Crow's house, and that she was specifically told by Mr. Crow himself to search for any business papers, and that he was, and I quote, in a rage when none were found. Hardly the actions of a man who has been robbed." Briggs shifted his weight, his confident smirk beginning to falter. He understood threats and violence, not papers and words. "And finally," Rosa said, her voice ringing with a conviction that reached every person on the street, "this is for the matter of my supposed character, which I know Mr. Crow has been so eager to slander." She held up the last piece of paper. "This is a signed and notarized statement from Dr. Michael Edwards of Denver, a respected physician. It states that Silas Crow attempted to have me committed to the state sanitarium for hysteria. It also states that after a thorough examination, Dr. Edwards found me to be, in his professional opinion, of sound mind and exceptional composure, showing no signs of any nervous affliction whatsoever. He concludes by stating that it was his belief that the accusation was a malicious attempt to silence and discredit a woman of good character." She let the silence hang in the air, a silence so profound you could hear the buzz of a fly. The lawyer, Finney, was utterly flustered. His legal ambush had been turned against him with a brilliant counterattack. He stared at the papers in Rosa's hand as if they were snakes. He had come prepared for a fight with a frightened, isolated woman, not a legal battle against a well-armed opponent in front of an audience. Elias watched her, a feeling of profound awe washing over him. He had seen her as strong, as brave, but he had always seen himself as her protector, the shield between her and the dangers of this world. He realized now how wrong he had been. She did not need a shield. She was a sword, sharp and bright and true. She was fighting her own battle, with her own weapons, and she was winning, in that moment. His desire to protect her transformed into a deep and abiding respect. She was not a woman he needed to stand in front of. She was a woman he was proud to stand beside, an equal, a partner. Dr. Avery chose that moment to step off the boardwalk. his medical bag in hand. "It seems to me," he said, his voice calm and reasonable, "that there are some serious questions of legality here. As the closest thing this town has to an educated professional, I would advise Marshal Briggs that attempting to enforce these dubious warrants in the face of such compelling counter-evidence could have serious repercussions for your own career." Jake the blacksmith took a slow, deliberate step forward, his heavy hammer resting in his hand. "And as a citizen," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I would advise you to get back in your fancy carriage and ride out of town before you find out what Pine Mesa thinks of bullies who hide behind crooked lawyers." Finney had heard enough. He looked at Briggs, at the unmoving wall that was Elias Boone, at the slowly closing circle of angry, determined townspeople. This was a losing fight. "A temporary misunderstanding," he stammered, snatching his writ back and stuffing it haphazardly into his briefcase. "We will return to the county seat and clarify the matter." "You do that," Elias said, his voice flat. The lawyer practically scrambled back into the carriage. Briggs shot Elias a look of pure hatred, a silent promise of future violence. Before mounting his horse, he and his men wheeled their horses around and escorted the carriage out of town, leaving a trail of dust and humiliation in their wake. The town let out a collective sigh, the tension breaking like a fever. People started talking at once, clapping Jake on the back, shaking Dr. Avery's hand. They looked at Rosa with a new respect. She was not just the new seamstress anymore. She was one of them. She had stood her ground and fought for her name, and in doing so, she had fought for them all. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows down the street, Elias and Rosa sat alone in her shop. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. They had won. For today. "They will be back," Elias said. It was not a question. "I know," Rosa replied, carefully putting her papers back into her portfolio. "But they know we will fight. They know the town will fight." "That is what worries me," Elias said, his voice grim. He looked out the window at the deepening twilight. A man like Crow, when he cannot win with the law, he uses something else, and when he cannot scare people into selling, he makes it so they have no other choice. He thought of the fire, of the close call with the law. These were attempts to isolate and break them. They had failed. Crow would not make that mistake again. His next move would be against the town itself. Something so big, so devastating, that it would shatter their fragile unity. "The mine," Elias said suddenly, the idea coming to him with a chilling certainty. He has been quiet about the mine, but it is the key to all of this. "What about it?" Rosa asked. "He will not wait to buy the land to open it," Elias said, his eyes dark with foreboding. "He will open it first, unsafely. He will cut corners on timbering, on ventilation. He will create a disaster, a collapse, an explosion." He looked at her, his meaning clear, and then he will use that disaster. He will say Pine Mesa is too dangerous, that the risk of industrial accidents is too great. He will offer to buy the land, not as a predator, but as a savior, rescuing the good people from the dangers he created himself. He will break this town not with writs or guns, but with tragedy. The threat was no longer visible. Like Briggs in the street, it was something deeper, something buried in the earth beneath their feet, a dark seed of a plan that, if it came to fruition, would destroy them all. The sound came first, a deep guttural roar from within the earth, a sound that was felt as much as heard. It was followed by a tremor that rattled the windows in Rosa's shop and shook the floorboards beneath her feet. The teacup on her table vibrated against its saucer with a sharp, chattering cry. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, from the direction of the new mine, a plume of black smoke and red dust erupted into the clean blue sky, a foul blossom of manufactured disaster. Elias's prediction had become a horrific reality. The town did not need an alarm bell this time. The explosion was its own summons. Men poured out of the saloon and the general store, their faces pale with shock and a dawning, sickening understanding. Women appeared in doorways, hands pressed to their mouths. Elias was already moving. He had been mending a fence on the edge of his property, the one closest to town, and had seen the plume of smoke the instant it appeared. He rode into the main street not at a gallop, but at a steady, ground-eating canter, his face set like stone. His time in the cavalry had taught him that panic was a more dangerous enemy than any man with a gun. "Jake!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of fear. "The blacksmith met him in the middle of the street. Get every shovel and pickaxe you can find. And lanterns. We will need lanterns." Jake nodded once, his jaw tight, and sprinted toward his smithy. "Dr. Avery," Elias called out, spotting the man hurrying from his office with his black bag. "We will need a place for the wounded, away from the mine entrance." "The church," the doctor replied without breaking stride. "It is the biggest space." Elias turned his attention to the women, who were gathering in a confused, frightened cluster. Rosa was already among them, her face white but her eyes clear and focused. Their gazes met across the street, a silent acknowledgement of the nightmare they had both foreseen. "Rosa," he called, and she came to him immediately. "The doctor is right. The church. Organize the women. We will need bandages, clean water, blankets, everything you can find." She nodded, her mind already working. "I will. Go. Elias, get them out." He wheeled his horse and spurred it toward the mine, a stream of men following in his wake, a grim army armed with farm tools and a desperate hope. The scene at the mine entrance was one of utter devastation. The timbered opening had collapsed into a ragged maw of splintered wood and fallen rock. A thick, choking dust hung in the air, tasting of coal and something metallic and wrong. A handful of miners who had been near the entrance lay on the ground, moaning, their faces and clothes blackened. The shift foreman was trying to do a head count, his voice shaking. 8 men, he said, his eyes wide with horror as Elias rode up. "At least 8 men are still down there. We heard them yelling, but now it is just quiet." Elias dismounted, his movements calm and deliberate, a rock of stability in the swirling chaos. He took charge not by shouting, but by speaking with an authority that no one questioned. He organized the men into teams, one to clear the rubble at the entrance, carefully, piece by piece, another to reinforce the remaining timbers to prevent a further collapse, a third to stand by, ready to relieve the others. He worked alongside them, his bandaged arm a dull, throbbing ache, his hands raw on the splintered wood and sharp rock. He set a rhythm, a steady pace of work that was born of grim determination, not frantic haste. At the church, Rosa had created a sanctuary of order amidst the terror. She had dispatched children to every house in town to gather sheets, whiskey for disinfectant, and any available medical supplies. The pews had been pushed back to make room for pallets on the floor. Women who had been paralyzed with fear found themselves tearing bandages and boiling water under Rosa's calm direction. Even Beatrice Whitcomb, her face stripped of its usual sourness by the scale of the tragedy, worked without complaint, her hands moving as swiftly as any other. Rosa moved among the wounded men who had been brought from the mine, cleaning cuts, applying poultices, her voice a low, soothing murmur. The smell of smoke and fear clung to everything. At one point, a wave of dizziness washed over her, the acrid air making her lungs burn. The world tilted, the faces around her blurring. She gripped the back of a pew, her vision tunneling to a small point of black. And then there was nothing. She awoke moments later on a cot in the corner, a damp cloth on her forehead. Dr. Avery was standing over her. "You need to rest, my dear," he said gently. "The men," she whispered, trying to sit up. "Are being cared for," he said, pushing her gently back down. "You have done more than enough. You cannot help anyone if you collapse yourself." But she shook her head, a stubborn fire returning to her eyes. She sat up, slower this time, took a deep drink of water, and stood on shaky legs. "There is still work to do," she said, and went back to it. For hours, the town worked as one, a single organism with a single purpose to pull their friends and neighbors from the belly of the earth. As darkness fell, The scene was lit by the eerie, flickering glow of dozens of lanterns, casting long, dancing shadows that made the men look like phantoms. They finally broke through the main blockage just after midnight. A cheer went up, raw and hoarse, as the first miner, a young man named Billy, was carried out, alive but barely conscious. Then another, and another. Each man brought to the surface was a small victory against the crushing weight of the mountain. Elias worked without stopping, his face a mask of soot and sweat. He went into the unstable shaft himself, ignoring the groans of the stressed timbers, to help carry the wounded. He seemed to be running on sheer will, his movements economical, his focus absolute. They brought the last man out as the first hint of gray was beginning to soften the eastern sky. He was alive, but his leg was crushed. Elias helped carry him to the waiting wagon. And only when the man was safely on his way to the church did the strength that had sustained him for 9 brutal hours finally desert him. He leaned against the wagon wheel, his head bowed, his body trembling with an exhaustion so profound it was like a physical blow. The world seemed to sway around him. A hand touched his arm, small and gentle. He looked up. It was Rosa. Her face was smudged with dirt, her dress was torn, and there were dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes. But to him, she had never been more beautiful. "It is over, Elias," she said softly. "You did it. They are all out." He could only nod, too tired to speak. "Come," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Let me take you home." He did not argue. He let her lead him to his horse, let her help him into the saddle. He swayed, and she walked beside him, her hand resting on his leg to steady him. The walk to his ranch was silent, a slow procession of 2 weary survivors through the quiet dawn. His house was a refuge from the chaos and the grief. Rosa built a fire in the hearth while he washed the grime from his face and hands in a basin of cold water. She made coffee, strong and black, and the rich aroma began to chase away the lingering smell of the mine. She found a bottle of whiskey and poured a generous measure into his cup. They sat at the small kitchen table, the warmth from the fire slowly seeping into their chilled bones. They did not speak. There were no words for what they had seen, for the shared trauma that now bound them as surely as any vow. Outside, the world was full of pain and uncertainty, of men who would use tragedy as a tool for their own greed. But in here, in the quiet glow of the fire, there was a fragile peace. Rosa looked at him, at the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, at the fresh scratches on his face, at his bandaged arm, a stark white reminder of the last time he had thrown himself into the path of danger for this town. She thought of the whispers, of the trouble that seemed to follow her, the trouble that had now escalated into a disaster that had nearly cost men their lives. A wave of guilt and sorrow washed over her. She spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the crackle of the flames. "If everything about me brings you trouble," she asked, her gaze fixed on her hands, clasped tightly on the table, "if my past, if the men who follow me, if all of it just brings fire and warrants and danger to your door, will you still want me?" The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. It was an offering of all her fears, all her insecurities. Elias did not answer with words. He rose from his chair and came to her, pulling her gently to her feet. He drew her close, against his chest, until she could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart. He was so solid, so real. He smelled of smoke and earth and clean sweat. He rested one hand on the small of her back, and with the other, he gently covered her own hand, which she had pressed against her chest as if to quiet the frantic fluttering within. He held her like that for a long moment, simply feeling the frantic, frightened rhythm of her heart under his palm. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her hair. "Forever," he whispered, the word a solemn promise in the quiet room. It was all he said, and all she needed to hear. The walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart, the ones built of pride and fear and a fierce need for independence, crumbled into dust. She leaned into him, her exhaustion and her fear melting away in the solid strength of his embrace. He held her, not with the passion of a suitor, but with the deep, quiet tenderness of a man who has found his anchor in a storm. It was a promise of partnership, a shared and unspoken understanding that they would face whatever came next, together. After a long time, he led her to the chair by the fire and sat on the floor at her feet, leaning his head against her knee. She ran her fingers through his hair, the simple, domestic gesture more intimate than any kiss. They were a couple now, forged not in courtship or romance, but in the fires of adversity. Their bond was not one of words, but of deeds. "He will use this," she said quietly, staring into the flames. "Crow." "I know," Elias answered, his voice a low rumble. "He will come back, talking of safety regulations and offering to buy the land to protect us from ourselves. We have to be ready." "My evidence is not enough," she said. "It proves his corruption, but it will not stop him from using this disaster against the town." "No," Elias agreed. "We cannot just defend ourselves anymore. We have to attack not with guns, with the one thing he values." "His money," she said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "We have to find a way to make his plans for Pine Mesa so expensive, so public, that his investors get nervous. We have to turn his greatest strength into his greatest weakness." They sat in silence, watching the fire burn low. The night was over. A new, more difficult day had begun. But for the first time, they were not facing it alone. They were facing it together, bound by a single, whispered word that held the weight of a lifetime. The train whistle was different this time. It was not the distant, mournful cry that had become part of the valley's soundscape. This was a sharp, imperious blast, followed by the screech of brakes. A private rail car, its varnish gleaming like a black beetle's shell, had been shunted onto a temporary siding just a mile from town. From it emerged a man who needed no introduction. Silas Crow had come to Pine Mesa. He did not ride in a dusty carriage. He came on a magnificent bay gelding, flanked by his lawyer, Finney, and a half-dozen new men, each one bearing the hard, vacant look of a hired gun. Deputy Marshal Briggs rode at their head, his badge a small, cynical glint of light on his chest. They moved down the main street not as visitors, but as an occupying force, their horses' hooves churning the red dust into a choking cloud. The town fell silent. The work of rebuilding and healing from the mine disaster stopped. Men put down their tools, women gathered their children, doors opened, and people stepped onto the boardwalks, their faces grim and set. This was not a surprise. It was an inevitability. They stopped in the middle of the street, a formidable line of money and power, directly in front of Heart and Thread. Elias stepped out of the shop to meet them. He was not wearing his rifle. Today, he wore a Colt Peacemaker strapped to his hip, the way he had in the cavalry. It felt like a betrayal of the life he had wanted, but a necessity for the life he now had. Rosa came to stand just behind his shoulder, her hands empty, her portfolio left inside. The evidence she carried was in her mind and heart. Silas Crow was a man built of fine materials. His suit was tailored, his boots were polished, and his face was a mask of cold, predatory arrogance. He looked past Elias as if he were a piece of furniture and fixed his gaze on Rosa. "Miss Hart," Crow said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished stone, "my patience has come to an end. Marshal Briggs has a warrant for your arrest on the charge of theft. You will come with us now, and you will return what is mine." "She is not going anywhere," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness, "and nothing she has is yours." Crow finally deigned to look at Elias, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "Boone, the righteous rancher. Tell me, how does it feel to know that 8 of your neighbors were nearly buried alive because of your stubbornness? I came here to bring industry, to bring progress. But you and this woman resisted. That mine collapse was a tragedy, a preventable tragedy. If only the town had accepted my generous offer to manage its resources properly from the start." "We know what you did," Elias said, his voice flat, refusing to rise to the bait. "You cut corners on the timbering, You ignored safety warnings from your own foreman. You created that disaster to break this town's spirit, to scare us into selling our land to the very man who endangered us." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jake the blacksmith took a step forward, his hammer in his hand. Lila watched from the saloon doorway, her shotgun resting on the bar just inside. Crow's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. He had expected fear, not defiance. "These are baseless accusations, slander. Now stand aside, or you will be charged with obstructing justice." "It is not slander if it is the truth," Rosa said, her voice ringing out. "Clear and steady." She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Elias, no longer behind him. She was his partner in this, not a charge to be protected. She looked directly at Silas Crow, her green eyes blazing with a fire that matched her hair. "You want to talk about theft, Mr. Crow," she said, her voice rising so everyone could hear. "Let us talk about what you have stolen." She began to speak, not of ledgers and receipts, but of things far more personal, far more damning. "I have here," she said, though she held nothing in her hands, the papers committed to memory, their copies safely hidden, a certified copy of a letter from your mother, Eleanor Crow, to your family's trustee in Philadelphia. In it, she expresses grave concerns about your handling of the trust she established for the widows and orphans of your father's first factory fire. She notes that substantial funds appear to have been diverted for speculative Western ventures. She calls it, and these are her own words, a betrayal of your father's legacy and a stain on the family name. An audible gasp went through the crowd. Crow's face, which had been a mask of arrogant control, began to crack. His color deepened to a dark, mottled red. This was an attack he had never anticipated. It was personal. It was familial. It struck at the very heart of his carefully constructed public image as a builder of dynasties. "You lie," he hissed, his voice losing its polished veneer. "Do I?" Rosa countered, her voice relentless. "Then perhaps you would care to explain the entries in your own private accounts ledger, the one you so foolishly left on your desk. The payment of $10,000 to a judge in Helena to dismiss the inquiry into that trust fund. The $5,000 paid to a newspaper editor to print stories praising your philanthropy. The regular payments to Marshal Briggs here, listed under a regional security expenses." Briggs flinched as if he had been struck. Every eye on the street turned to him, and he could not meet their gaze. "And the best part," Rosa continued, her voice sharp with righteous fury, "is the $500 paid to the Pine Mesa County tax assessor, noted as, and I quote, an investment in future land acquisitions. Which brings us to the matter of the law you are so eager to enforce." As if on cue, Dr. Avery stepped forward from the crowd. He was holding a large, dusty ledger. "Mr. Crow, Mr. Finney," he said, his voice the calm center of the storm. "You have made many claims based on fraudulent tax records. I believe this will clarify the matter. This is the town's original tax ledger, which the previous clerk entrusted to me for safekeeping before he moved away. It shows that not a single resident of Pine Mesa is delinquent. In fact, most have paid in advance." The foundation of Crow's legal attack had been utterly demolished. He was exposed, not as a captain of industry, but as a common swindler, a man who would cheat widows and bribe officials to get what he wanted. His authority was gone, his pretense of legality stripped away. All he had left was violence. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to Briggs. The marshal, his face a mask of rage and humiliation, went for his gun. He was fast, but Elias was faster. The world seemed to slow down. Elias did not draw in anger or in fear. He drew with the practiced, fluid economy of a man for whom the weapon was an extension of his will. His Colt was in his hand, cocked and fired in a single, seamless motion. The crack of the shot was sharp and loud in the tense silence. It was not the sound of a killing. It was the sound of a choice. Briggs cried out, a sound of shock and pain, and his pistol clattered to the dust. A neat, smoking hole drilled through the metal of its trigger guard. He stared at his hand, at the stinging powder burns and the splintered wood of the grip, then at Elias, his eyes wide with disbelief. Elias had not aimed at him. He had aimed at his gun. He had disarmed him, humiliated him, without spilling a drop of his blood. Elias stood there, smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt, his face grim. "It is over, Crow," he said, his voice low and steady. For a moment, it seemed as if the other hired guns would draw, but then another sound echoed in the street, a sound more final than a gunshot. It was the heavy, metallic click of a dozen rifle hammers being pulled back to full cock. Jake, the Hendersons, the miners who had been pulled from the rubble, even old man Hemlock from the general store, they all stood with rifles leveled, a silent, unmovable wall of community will. Crow looked at the sea of determined faces, at the barrels of the guns all pointed at him and his men. He looked at his disarmed marshal, at his useless lawyer, and at the man and woman who had undone him. He was beaten. He pulled viciously on the reins of his horse, turning it so sharply that it reared in protest. "This is not over," he snarled, his voice a venomous promise. "I will tear this town down to the bedrock. I will salt the earth where your houses stand." He spurred his horse and galloped out of town, his men scrambling to follow, a disorganized and defeated rabble in his wake. The townspeople did not cheer. They lowered their rifles with a quiet, collective sigh of relief. The immediate danger had passed. Elias uncocked his pistol and slid it back into its holster. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Rosa looking up at him, her eyes shining with tears and something more pride and a deep, unwavering love. He turned then to face the people who had stood with them, his friends and neighbors. He had never been a man for speeches, but he knew he owed them an explanation, and he owed it to himself. "I came here looking for peace," he said, his voice rough with emotion but carrying to every person on the street. "I wanted nothing more than to be left alone with my cattle and my land. I was wrong." He looked around, meeting the eyes of the people who had fought beside him. "I have learned that peace is not a place you can find. It is something you have to make, and sometimes you have to defend it. Together." A rider appeared at the end of the street then, coming from the direction of the county seat. He wore the official star of a county sheriff. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene, the armed townspeople, the discarded pistol in the dust. He looked at Elias, then at the retreating cloud of dust that was Silas Crow and his men. "I got a telegram an hour ago," the sheriff said, his voice weary. "From a judge in Helena, something about a railroad man and some very serious accusations. Looks like I got here a bit late for the party." He nodded at Elias. "I am going to need to take a lot of statements." The law had finally arrived, not Crow's law, but the real law, slow and imperfect, but now forced to act. As the sheriff began to talk to Dr. Avery, Rosa stepped closer to Elias. She looked around at the dusty street, at the familiar, determined faces of the people who had risked their lives for their homes. For her, this was not a temporary shelter anymore, a place to hide until the storm passed. This was home, her home. She had found her place, not in a quiet life, but in a shared struggle, standing beside a man who would face down the devil himself to defend what was right. The dust settled slowly in the wake of Silas Crow's departure. There was no triumphant cheer, only a deep, collective exhale, as if the entire town had been holding its breath for months. The immediate threat was gone, but the wounds remained. The mine was a gaping, silent scar on the hillside, and the families of the injured men faced a winter of uncertainty. The confrontation had not ended with a gunshot, but with the quiet scratching of the county sheriff's pen as he took statement after statement, building a wall of paper and truth around Pine Mesa. The healing began not in the saloon with celebratory drinks, but in the church, with the quiet murmur of planning. It was Rosa who called the first meeting. She stood before the assembled townsfolk, not as an outsider or a dressmaker, but as one of their own, her voice clear and steady. "We stood together to face a threat from the outside," she said, her gaze sweeping across the familiar faces, Now we must stand together to heal what is broken on the inside. She proposed the creation of a community fund, a portion of every sale at the general store, a small percentage of profits from the blacksmith and the saloon, a tithe from the ranchers' cattle sales. The money would first go to the families of the miners, ensuring they had food and firewood for the coming winter. After that, it would go towards improving the town itself. A proper road to replace the muddy track that led to the county seat, and more importantly, a school for the children. Elias stood at the back of the church, watching her. A few months ago, he would have taken this burden on himself, trying to solve the problem with his own resources, his own strength. He would have seen it as his solitary responsibility. But watching Rosa rally the community, watching Jake the blacksmith voice his immediate support, seeing John Henderson nod in firm agreement, he felt not a lessening of his own purpose, but a strengthening of it. He was not alone in this. The peace he had wanted was not something one man could build or defend. It was a structure that had to be raised by many hands. He had learned to trust the strength of others, to see it not as a substitute for his own, but as a vital complement. To everyone's surprise, the first person to pledge a substantial sum to the new fund was Beatrice Whitcomb, the mayor's wife, who had once wielded gossip like a weapon, stood and, in a voice cleared of its usual acidity, said simply, "This town is my home. Its people are my people. The fund will have my full support." It was an apology and a promise, and it was accepted with quiet grace. The last of the town's divisions was beginning to heal. Rosa, for her part, found herself shedding the last remnants of the armor she had worn for so long. In the evenings, she and Elias would sit at his kitchen table, going over the town's accounts, their heads bent together over the ledger. One night, as a cold wind rattled the window panes, a harbinger of the coming winter, she paused, her pen hovering over the page. "I still feel it sometimes," she said softly, not looking at him. "A flicker of fear, that I am a burden, that my past is a shadow that will always cling to your doorstep." Elias reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His touch was warm and steady, a silent contradiction to her words. "A person is only a burden if they are being carried," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You, Rosa, have never been carried. You walk beside me. And sometimes," he added, a rare, gentle smile touching his lips, "you are the one clearing the path." He turned her hand over and traced the lines on her palm. "I told you forever. That did not mean forever in spite of the trouble. It meant forever, through all of it. The trouble is part of our story. It is the ground we planted our life in." She looked up at him then, and the last of her fear dissolved in the warmth of his gaze. She had spent a lifetime believing that to be loved was to be rescued, to be owned. But this was different. This was a partnership, a love built not on dependence but on mutual respect. She was not a liability he had taken on. She was the partner he had chosen. She finally allowed herself to believe it, to rest in the certainty of it, and the feeling was one of profound peace. The letters arrived in late autumn, carried by a rider from the county seat. The first was from the territorial government. An official inquiry had been launched into the business practices of Silas Crow. Prompted by the sworn testimonies from Pine Mesa and corroborated by evidence from a dozen other communities his railroad had touched, Crow was tangled in a web of legal battles in Helena. His assets frozen, his reputation in tatters. His war on Pine Mesa was over. He was too busy trying to save himself. The second letter was from the Transcontinental Railroad Company itself. A new board of directors, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, had reviewed the plans for the Montana Spur, citing geological instabilities and unforeseen community development. The letter stated that the proposed route through the Pine Mesa Valley had been officially abandoned. A new, more northerly route was being surveyed. The creek, the lifeblood of the valley, was safe. The town had won. They were married on a crisp afternoon in late October, when the aspen trees on the surrounding hills had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold. There was no church service, no formal reception. They stood on a small rise overlooking Elias's ranch. The whole of Pine Mesa spread out below them. The entire town was in attendance, their family, Dr. Avery, who had a license to perform such ceremonies, officiated. Elias did not wear a suit, but his best wool coat. Rosa had made her own dress, a simple gown of deep green wool that matched the color of her eyes. She carried a bouquet of late-season wildflowers and dried grasses. Their vows were not the traditional words from a book. They had written them themselves, speaking them to each other in low, earnest voices. "I came here seeking a quiet life," Elias said, his eyes holding hers. "I found something better. I found a life with purpose. You taught me that a home is not just land and a roof, but a community worth fighting for. I promise to be your partner, to share the burdens, and to stand with you against any storm. I promise to build our life with you, hand in hand." Rosa's voice was thick with emotion when she spoke, but it did not waver. "I came here seeking a safe harbor," she said, her hand tight in his. "I found something better. I found a home. You taught me that my past does not define me, and that my strength is something to be proud of. You taught me to trust. I promise to be your partner, to share the joys, and to be the shelter in your storm. My heart is your home, Elias Boone, now and forever." When Dr. Avery pronounced them husband and wife, there was no loud applause, but a warm, heartfelt murmur of assent from the gathered crowd, and the kiss they shared was gentle, a quiet sealing of a promise already made and proven a dozen times over. The first snow of the season came a week later. It began in the night, a soft, silent fall of white flakes. By morning, a thick, pristine blanket covered everything. It muted the sounds of the world, creating a profound and peaceful quiet. The red dust, the ever-present symbol of hardship and threat, was gone, buried under a layer of pure white. It was a cleansing, a baptism. In town, a new sign hung beside the door of the dress shop. In neat, clean letters, it read "Hart and Boone," and underneath, a smaller sign had been added: "Sewing and pattern-making lessons for girls, Tuesday afternoons." Out at the ranch, there were new sounds. The ring of a hammer came from the direction of the bunkhouse, which Elias was expanding. He had hired 3 of the miners who had lost their jobs when the mine had closed for good. They were not experienced ranch hands, but they were good men who needed work. And Elias was a patient teacher. Rosa stood on the porch of the main house, her house now, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched Elias down by the corral, showing one of the new men how to properly cinch a saddle. He looked up and saw her, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had finally found his peace, not in solitude, but in the rich, complicated, and beautiful life they were building together. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in a clean, new beginning. The year 1895 found Pine Mesa bathed in a new kind of light. At dusk, glass bulbs strung along the main street hummed to life, casting a steady, golden glow that was a world away from the flickering, uncertain light of the old kerosene lamps. The light fell on a town transformed. The street was no longer a river of red dust, but a wide, graded road. There was a new schoolhouse, its bell a bright, cheerful sound on weekday mornings, and the church had a new coat of white paint. The railroad, the great iron beast that had once threatened to devour them, now passed a respectable 2 miles to the north, its distant whistle a part of the landscape, no more threatening than the cry of a hawk. Progress had come to Pine Mesa, but it had come on the town's own terms. Inside the Hart and Boone Mercantile, the warm electric light illuminated a scene of quiet industry. The shop had expanded, taking over the space next door to become the undisputed heart of the town's commerce. But on this Tuesday afternoon, one side of the shop was given over to a different kind of enterprise. Rosa stood in the center of a circle of young girls, their brows furrowed in concentration as they guided fabric under the needles of their sewing machines. Her hair, still as fiery as ever, was pinned up in a more matronly style, but the same intelligent light shone in her green eyes. She moved from girl to girl, offering a quiet word of encouragement, a gentle hand to guide a difficult stitch. She was not just teaching them a trade. She was teaching them a form of independence, a way to shape their own futures, one seam at a time. Elias watched from the doorway for a moment, unseen. He was on his way home from a meeting of the town council. At 49, his dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and the lines on his face had been softened by years of peace. But the same quiet strength was there in his posture, in the steady calm of his gaze. He no longer wore the Colt peacemaker as a matter of course. It hung on a peg by the door of his home, a tool for a job he rarely had to do, like protecting the herd from a wolf. His battles now were fought with words and reason around a heavy oak table in the town hall. He watched his wife, saw the easy confidence with which she moved, the respect the girls gave her, and a familiar warmth spread through his chest. He had thought he wanted a quiet life, but the rich, full life he had found was infinitely better. The council meeting had been the final, quiet echo of their old struggles. A new company, an Eastern syndicate dealing in shipping and logistics, had sent a representative. The man was polished and polite, his arguments full of talk of jobs and prosperity. He wanted the town to sell the wide, green pasture that bordered Pine Creek, the very land Silas Crow had once tried to seize. He had plans for a large warehouse, a depot for goods to be loaded onto the new railroad line. The offer was tempting. The money was substantial. A few of the newer members of the council had argued in its favor, but when it was Elias's turn to speak, he had not spoken of profit or loss. He had spoken of memory. "Some of you were not here," he had said, his voice a low, even rumble, "when that piece of land was the line between our survival and our destruction. Some of you did not see the fire, or the mine collapse, or the day we stood in the street and faced down a man who thought he could buy our souls as easily as he bought our politicians." He had looked around the table, at Jake, now a grandfather, his hands gnarled but still strong, at Dr. Avery, his hair now completely white. That land is not just grass and water. It is a monument. It is a promise we made to ourselves and to our children, a promise that this community is not for sale. It is a public trust. I vote to keep it that way. The vote had been unanimous. The legacy of their fight was secure. That evening, they sat on the porch of the ranch house, the day's work done. The sky above was a vast, deep canvas, strewn with a brilliant spray of stars. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and curing hay. In the distance, the lights of Pine Mesa were a warm, comforting glow. The world felt settled, at peace. From far away, the train whistle blew, a long, lonely note that dissolved into the vast silence of the night. It was a sound that no longer held any menace. It was just a sound, a reminder of the world beyond their valley, a world that could touch them, but could no longer break them. Rosa leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. "The night of the explosion in the kitchen, by the fire." Elias nodded, his arm tightening around her. "I remember everything about that night." "I was so afraid," she confessed, her voice a near whisper, not of Crow, but that I was a curse, that I would be the thing that ruined the quiet life you wanted. He was silent for a moment. Then he reached into the small wooden box that sat on the table beside his chair, a box where he kept small, important things. He took out a small object and placed it in her palm. It was a piece of petrified wood, worn smooth by time, its surface a swirl of dark, earthy colors. "I found this the morning after," he said, "near the mine entrance. It was half buried in the rubble. It is a piece of the mountain itself, old and strong, and it survived the fire. I kept it to remind me. To remind you of what she asked, her fingers closing around the smooth, cool stone. That the strongest things," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur against her hair, "are not the things that are never broken. They are the things that are broken and put themselves back together again. That is you. That is this town. That is us." He paused, then whispered the word that had been the foundation of their life together. the answer to her fearful question on that terrible night. Forever. They sat in a comfortable silence, two people intertwined, watching the stars. Their life was not a fairy tale. It had not ended with a ride into the sunset. It had continued, day by day, season by season. New families had moved into the valley, their children now playing in the schoolyard. The babies born in the year of the mine collapse were now young men and women, with dreams and futures of their own. Life went on, a steady, flowing river, and their love was not a static, perfect thing, but a living, breathing part of that current. Its strength tested and proven by the shared work of their hands and the unwavering choice of their hearts. The night was filled with the soft, rhythmic chirping of crickets, a timeless sound of the earth, and in the distance, the faint, humming presence of the train. The wild heart of the West had not been tamed, but it had made room for a home, a place of enduring love, built on the red dust of Pine Mesa. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.